In places, its slopes are gentle, rolling peacefully toward the vast plains of Africa. While nearby, it will drop away dramatically, and you can imagine that this is indeed where the Earth split in two. And both views are true to the nature of Africa's Great Rift. Such a striking feature of the Earth's surface, it can be seen from outer space. Hi, I'm George Page. Here in Kenya, the Great Rift reveals itself in a variety of wonderful ways. It's always surprising, always mysterious, always awesome. It casts a spell over the human imagination. For me, it's the most magical of places, because in all probability, this is where human life began. And our earliest ancestors must have shared these very sights and sounds. In the first of 3 programs, we now begin our exploration of Africa's Great Rift, with its legendary wildlife and its astonishing topography. For millions of years, a vast slice of the Earth has been relentlessly pulling itself apart, creating a world of new landscapes, each brimming with its own special wealth of animals and plants. Here, animals rule in the greatest concentrations ever known. One of the animals that evolved in this valley is a creature that learned to live in all the new landscapes. Eventually, he spread out across the world, but his first home was here, in the Great Rift of Africa. The planet Earth is fluid. It's still more or less the same molten star drop that it was when 5 billion years ago it was formed from gases surrounding the sun. It has a thin outer crust, but even that is fragmentary, brittle, and afloat on a ball of magma, which bubbles, pushes, and tears at it from beneath. Like the surface of a pot of boiling custard, continents and seabeds heave and sink, pop and split, get caught up in currents, and cool and harden. We who live on this skin are so small and perceive the world on a time scale so brief that unless something shudders under us or explodes above us, we no more notice the crust's motion than we see its curvature. But in one slice of the world, the Great Rift of Africa, the violence of the upheaval has created a landscape that looks like a storm at sea. Everything, it seems, is caught in an instant. Cliffs hang like waves over choppy valley troughs, and volcanoes rise up from flat land like sudden splashes. The Great Rift is like a long, curling fissure, starting in Mozambique and on its way northward, creating highlands and valleys, pocked by craters and lakes, and crisscrossed by secondary faults. In Tanzania, it divides around Lake Victoria. It reconnects at the base of the Ethiopian highlands, becomes the Red Sea, and finally tapers out in Syria, 4,000 miles from its other end. It began about 25 million years ago, a virtual yesterday geologically, and yet it was the terrestrial feature most visible to a human on the moon, looking back at the place that made him. The rift is young, and year by year it is still widening. Volcanoes lying across the western side of the necklace continue to pull and tear at the crust, at the same time giving their own rich mountainsides and valleys a coating of new lava. The flicker of life caught in the middle is incidental. New life will succeed it. When lava flows or meets groundwater and causes an explosion of ash, it coats the floor of the sunken valleys. Ash and lava now lie thicker in places than the Antarctic ice cap. And sandwiched throughout, as if pressed in a book, are successive layers of the life of past millions of years. The Mashona people of Zimbabwe sing a hymn to their god Mawari, which begins, "Piler up of rocks into towering mountains, when thou stampest on the stone, the dust rises and fills the land." The life of the planetary skin not only has to survive scorching fire and smothering ash, it has to ride out the ever-changing conditions of altitude, topography, climate. It does this through the ultimate process of adaptation, evolution. Some life has even managed to use the insides of the new mountains, where a lava tube ceiling has collapsed, making way for a lush well of vegetation. In Mount Suswa in Kenya, these tubes can stretch for hundreds of yards. The pipe-like caves were left behind when the torrents of lava cooled on the outside while still running fast and hot in the middle. Their walls give a frozen glimpse of the inside of the planet. In one instant, the lava was liquid, in another, solid. Changes can be abrupt in either time or space. The buttresses of Hell's Gate, a lava flow that was eroded by ancient floodwater. There was a river here once and a lake. Now there is a flat, dry valley floor. If the landscape of the rift is like a solid sea, the rugged cliffs on its edges are like rocky shorelines. And Rupel's griffin vultures forage over the plains and valleys like seabirds, soaring on the updrafts. Other vultures in other places tend to nest in pairs in trees. Here, they are as colonial as gulls, their nests clustered on the same kind of precarious ledges. When the rift began, the age of dinosaurs had long passed, and the land already belonged to the mammals and birds. The valleys that these vultures overlook are not part of the largest rift on Earth, just the largest on land. There are larger rift valleys at the bottom of the Earth's great oceans, but those rifts began much nearer the birth of our planet. The Great African Rift is today's Great Rift, and someday, far in the future, there might be an ocean here, and the escarpments might be shorelines. But for now, the rift remains a dry valley. Yet at the western edge of the rift, mountains rise to capture moist, prevailing winds crossing Africa from the Atlantic. Clouds that once simply rained on the forest as they passed over are now caught by the mountaintops and held until every drop is squeezed out of them. The highest and wettest part of all includes a cluster of 7 volcanoes, the Virungas, at the conjunction of Rwanda, Uganda, and Zaire. Their landscape is a study of what happens when an ordinary piece of Central African rainforest is thrust toward the sky. Not only do crater lakes appear, but in these alpine meadows above the tree line are tree-sized succulents, descendants of small plants that used to live on the cool forest floor. The tree line here is at 10,000 feet, and with the forest begins darkness and dankness in a cool, moss-hung jungle. The iridescent sunbird, primarily a resident of the moist lowland forests of West Africa. Other small West African forest animals have adapted to the altitude by thickening their coats. The sun squirrel, the black-fronted duiker, the bushbuck, and this. The 16th century explorer Andrew Battelle described it as, in all proportion like a man, but more like a giant in stature. Battelle knew it as a pongo and said that they go many together and kill many men that travail in the woods. We now know it as a gorilla, and that it spends its life killing nothing more than enormous quantities of leaves and stems. Battelle's animal had a body full of hair, but not very thick, and of a dunnish color. Not quite the same as this. In fact, Battels was a gorilla of the warm lowland forests. These are mountain gorillas, which, like so many other mammals of the Virungas, have thick coats and black ones to retain heat. The mountain gorillas are endangered. There are only an estimated total of 400 to 450. These isolated mountaintops have always restricted their numbers, and now poaching and habitat loss threaten their survival. The gorillas must venture upslope to forage in the pastures. Downslope, their world is cut off by bamboo thickets that now include encroaching farmland. They are isolated, but in surroundings that are comfortable and bountiful, living a life of almost indolent ease, eating leaves, sleeping in leaf-padded nests, grooming, and playing. Males are at their most energetic when they do this, fight for the right to a harem. When they fight, they don't necessarily hurt each other, but these fights are serious all the same. And if one is defeated often enough, he might wander away to find another group. To frighten each other with their size and apparent ferocity is why, over generations, male gorillas have become so big and so fearsome. In their world, this competition is the only thing that resembles conflict. Otherwise, they live at peace in what amounts to a big salad bowl of wild celery, gallium, bedstraw, stinging nettles, which don't sting through thick fur, and goosegrass. As they eat, the families move in regular circuits, like short-distance nomads, and the vegetation continually recovers. They may have been stranded on these mountain slopes, but they have evolved in such harmony with their surroundings, it's as though they were stranded in paradise. The Virungas are the largest volcanoes that have arisen within the Western Rift. The valley floor pushes the magma like water in the wake of a boat to the edges, to places just outside the actual valley. Here, to the east, on the other side of the rift, is a volcano of an entirely different order. Kilimanjaro, at more than 19,000 feet, the tallest mountain in Africa. Kibo, the newest and highest of Kilimanjaro's 3 summits. It last erupted several centuries ago, and someday it may erupt again. Mount Kilimanjaro, like the Virungas, is alive and growing. Glaciers, 3 degrees south of the equator. When 19th century European explorers came home and told about this, people didn't believe them. The conventional view of Africa was that it represented all things unsophisticated, and that included geology. In 1891, Professor Henry Drummond wrote of Africa, "There is nothing new, no strange rock, no formation, texture, or structure to put the law of continuity to confusion." Another mountain, this one almost exactly on the equator, Mount Kenya. No longer active, and so now in the process of eroding and shrinking, and not quite as high as Kilimanjaro. But at 17,000 feet, high enough so that here, near the summit, at the equator, are animals that look as though they would be at home on the Arctic tundra. They are rock hyraxes, and are related to the hyraxes that live on rocky outcrops in the heat of the Serengeti. But here, they have to seek heat and conserve it, and their fur is similar to that of snowshoe hares or Arctic foxes. This tiny succulent, which grows only at the entrances to hyrax dens, is nibbled by the young animals, which seem to be practicing on it. Until, as adults, they can graze on more nutritious plants. A giant groundsel, which took about 50 years to reach this size. There is one important difference, though, between this mountaintop and the Arctic tundra. Here, there is a 12-hour day and a 12-hour night. In the Arctic, it is a year that has a day and a night, a cold, dark season and a season of sun and thaw. But on this equatorial mountain, everything has to adjust to a winter and a summer every day. At night, the moisture in the ground freezes and the earth folds up like a flower. The Kikuyu people of Kenya, who consider this region beyond the reach of humans, say that spirits, half flesh, half stone, live here. Morning. Spring. The morning thaw. In an hour, the temperature can rise almost 20 degrees. The plants survive the night by closing up and keeping in the heat they have absorbed during the day. In the sun, they open up to collect more warmth. And once every 7 years, they flower. The shaggy flowers can be up to 6 feet tall. These giant lobelias grow only on a band of moorland between 12 and 15,000 feet. The scarlet-tufted malachite sunbird, which lives on the lobelia's nectar, is found in other places, but only at this altitude, and only drinking nectar from giant lobelias. Every animal, everywhere, develops in harmony with the other elements in its environment. This sunbird's behavior, shape, and very existence are molded by these strange plants. The male's territory contains his lobelias. They are the props, the stage for his display. The female judges him as much on the quality of his lobelias as on his tail streamers, his wings, and his scarlet epaulets. Mount Kenya has been inactive for more than 1 million years, and only the crumbling remains of its original grandeur still stand. But compared to some other mountains in the rift, it's a youngster. Close by is a range of hills, the Aberdares, older by 3 million years and lower by 4,000 feet, with water grinding them ever closer to the rift floor. They have been worn down enough to have a gentle, rolling look, but there is still high moorland above the tree line. Those are not forests, but patches of giant heathers, plants that, like Mount Kenya's lobelias, have flourished in the absence of trees. The opening up of the rift has dramatically changed the nature of the landscape, creating fresh opportunities, a driving force in evolution. Some animals are great opportunists. One day an elephant simply walks a little farther and eats heather instead of leaves. Others are more specialized, their design changing over generations, specifically to their surroundings. Jackson's francolin is as characteristic of these heathlands as a red grouse is of Scotland's. Black and white auger buzzards occur throughout East Africa. But here, a lot of them are all black. Black servals, too, are found in the Aberdares and hardly anywhere else. Of all the physical adaptations, color change is probably the simplest for a species to make. Most wild cats have the occasional black phases wherever they are. But at these altitudes, and almost certainly because black is the color that absorbs heat best, the usual sandy-colored phase has all but disappeared. As the rift continues to widen, the valleys in the center become drier. But on mountains such as these, it can be wet enough for the forests to survive. It's an ancient place, a relic of forest that was probably here before rifting began. In the valley, conditions are too dry for most trees. Only isolated patches of remnant forest remain in vast seas of grass. And there is another influence on the nature of the forest. Change is not always caused by geology or by the vegetation shaping the animal. Sometimes it's the other way around. Here in the Aberdare Hills, the forest has been opened up into a sort of parkland, thanks to the efforts of the creatures with Africa's largest appetites. In fact, the elephants have, to a certain extent, even changed the shape of the ground. They dig for salt. Normally, they would find enough salt in the plants they eat, but in places as consistently wet as this, rainwater dissolves the natural salts in the soil. The salt drains into streams and is carried to the lowlands. Only in a few places is there a spot where water collects and the salt soaks back into the earth. In such places, the elephants dig, literally eat the soil, and change the landscape. The elephant's plowing creates a salt lick, an animal gathering place as important as a water hole is on the plains. giant forest hogs, primarily a West African animal. These East African hills, in their primeval lushness, are like an enclave of rainforest, more typical of West Africa. Only here do giant forest hogs live alongside buffalo, more a plains than a forest animal. The oxpecker, too, evolved on the plains, servicing the large hoofed animals of the dry forests and savannas. And lions are predators that grew just large enough to bring down animals of great size and strength, creatures as formidable as this. As long, that is, as they operate in teams, prides, packs. Lions are the only cats that hunt that way, but it's common in dogs and the two meat-eating apes, chimps and humans. A lion is a savanna predator that has learned to get by in the forest. So is the long-crested eagle. The crowned eagle, however, is designed for life in the forest. The forest where it lives has exceptionally tall trees. This eagle's nest is 80 feet up. With short, stubby wings for flying through gaps in the forest canopy, the crowned eagle is a strong, heavy aerial predator. Its single chick takes 2 years to reach independence. It preys mainly on animals such as monkeys, but will also take small antelopes. And not only can it carry the carcass up to a tree, it can carry at least half of it all the way back to the nest. The parents have been feeding the chick for the past 6 months, and even after it fledges, they will support it for another year or more. Among the animals that this young bird will be taught to catch are these, black and white colobus monkeys. When the ancestral monkeys began to live in trees, it was probably to get at the food there. Their feet came to be used for grasping, not walking, and their forefeet in particular developed into fine, flexible instruments for picking the treetop food. With this kind of monkey, traveling almost never involves the ground. It remains in the treetops, where it finds food and shelter. The effect that the ever-widening rift had on the forests of East Africa was to split them apart, to make them islands in a savanna sea. When that happened, the monkeys in each patch were isolated. The changing landscape affected altitude, rainfall, and temperature, making the forest islands subtly different from each other, but enough to cause the monkeys to change too and become distinct species. Back across the rift, 500 miles west of the Aberdares, in the Nyungwe forest of Rwanda, there are also black and white colobus monkeys. These lost contact with their cousins in the east hundreds of thousands of years ago. This forest is lower, warmer, and denser than the Aberdares, and the colobus here are dressed for that. They run in troops of 300 or 400 instead of the 30 or 40 in the Aberdares. Both species, though, have all-white infants. And as they travel, following behind them and sharing the food they find are black and white cast hornbills. The Ruwenzori turaco is as dependent on the trees for food and housing as the monkeys are. Birds evolved from the reptiles as daytime animals. Their main sense is vision, and color has become especially significant. In the trees, food, generally fruit, is selected by shape and color. The colors of the birds themselves have also become important in locating mates and in territorial displays. Light, refracting through the feathers, produces the brilliant hue of the great blue turaco. But not all of their food is found in trees. No one knows exactly what turacos get from the green filamentous algae, but it must be important, because to get it, they abandon their defensive stronghold in the treetops and risk becoming a light snack for a crocodile. Blue turaco. Blue monkey. If the birds evolved as animals of the day, the mammals, with their keen sense of smell, took over the night. Unlimited time, though, is the key to evolution, and all such rules are always broken. Some birds moved into the night, and some mammals came back to the day. Monkeys, like Lost's monkey, imitated birds in more than just their treetop existence. They also ate the same thing and needed to develop the same primary sense, vision. In fact, monkeys invaded the bird's niche, muscling in on the bargain between trees and bird, whereby trees provided food and shelter and the animals spread seeds. Monkeys and apes are practically the only mammals that can see color as well as birds. Olive baboon in the Mara, the plains north of the Serengeti. Unlike the permanently wet forests of the Aberdares and Nyungwe, here there are alternating wet and dry seasons. Sometimes the baboons feed like ordinary monkeys. Sometimes, though, they do what few other monkeys do. They forage on the ground. Their forelimbs, besides being used to grasp branches and handle things, have another function. They are simple, operational, walking legs. Baboons are primates that, because they could walk on the forest floor, could also move out of the forest and onto the savannas. Unlike tree-bound monkeys, they were not confined to the ancient forest islands. Baboons have prospered in the rift, crossing the barriers that other species could not. And once upon a time, there was another primate that also left the forest, an ape. One day, two adults and an adolescent walked across a small mud flat, probably on their way to a nearby lake. Soon after they passed, there was an eruption. A layer of ash covered and hardened the mud and preserved the footprints, to be uncovered more than 3.5 million years later as the world's earliest evidence of a primate that walked on 2 feet. Baboons, and indeed forest apes, use their forepaws, their hands, as feet. But this ape, Australopithecus afarensis, was different. The animal itself would have been very like a modern chimpanzee, except in its posture, in the shape of its hips, and in the fact that its hands were free to grasp things, carry things, pick things up. And it could travel farther and for longer periods than any primate ever had. Those were the famous Laetoli footprints, not far from a place that is often and perhaps appropriately called Eden, the Ngorongoro crater in Tanzania. In fact, Ngorongoro, which is like all of the rift concentrated in a 12-mile diameter bowl, did not even exist when the Laetoli footprints were made. But 3.5 million years is a long time, long enough for a 15,000-foot volcano to emerge from a valley in the eastern rift, and eventually to explode, collapse, and become a huge basin, the largest crater in the whole rift system. Now, because it's surrounded by walls more than 1/4 mile high, it's like a lost world, maintaining the atmosphere of ancient Africa in much the same way that Laetoli has kept the precise records. Ngorongoro has lakes, savanna, lowland forest, mountain forest, and all the classical East African animals, which differ from the animals of the Serengeti only in the fact that the grazers don't migrate. Almost all of them, predators and prey, live out their whole lives in their 12-mile diameter bowl. On the day the little upright apes made their footprints at Laetoli, other animals were there too, and they left their footprints. 3.5 million years ago, the feline predator and the grazing prey were well established. The same niches were there and were filled. But the cats would have been slightly larger and saber-toothed. The main pack hunters would have been hyenas, which were then as big as lions. One animal that has probably not changed very much is this. The primates, with the eyes for seeing color and the hands for picking fruit, were turning into meat eaters. But even operating in groups and perhaps wielding sticks and throwing stones, they would still not have been able to bring down the larger animals. And so they probably got a lot of their meat by scavenging. They might have fought with birds like these for the remains of saber-tooth kills. The widening rift has not only created steady eruptions of evolution in a landscape that has changed continuously, but has also provided some of Africa's best deposits of fossils. And this is the best of all, Olduvai Gorge. This 100-yard deep ravine in Tanzania is a record of life that goes back nearly 2 million years. And at the bottom, something besides bones. Stones. At about 1.9 million years ago, a primate appeared with a brain capacity half as big again as the upright apes. And what dawned in that brain was this: you don't have to wait until you find a sharp stone to cut with. You can sharpen one yourself. These are probably hand axes, the first known tools. The cruder tools were made by the first known member of the genus of man, Homo habilis, handyman. The more symmetrical ones, about 500,000 years later, by his successor, Homo erectus. And then, about 1.5 million years later still, art, capturing the essence of the very experience of living on walls of stone. The caves of Kondoa in Tanzania, painted by full-fledged Homo sapiens about 6,000 years ago, so recent on the evolutionary scale that it's practically the last thing that happened before spaceflight. Conceptually, it is certainly no different from art today. This film, taken in 1961, of the Hadza people of the Lake Eyasi region of the Eastern Rift, gives a rare, if not unique, view of the life of a community of nomadic East African hunter-gatherers. The first Homo sapiens, no different except in the most superficial details from any human being alive today, appeared in this part of the world about 100,000 years ago. The Hadza people are now living where those people lived, following a way of life that might have some resemblances to theirs. The hand that evolved to clasp tree branches and pick berries now operates a complicated hunting weapon. The enormous human brain is capable of anticipating the future and planning for it. The fingers are still used for plucking fruit, but the arms are adorned by art. The whole activity is coordinated by a complexity of words and grammar. Berries, instead of being eaten on the spot, are kept for a meal in that characteristically human time, later. The ability to fashion tools, to reason, and to learn from both experience and previous generations yields food that cannot initially be seen or sensed in any other way. And the old primate custom of operating in groups is expanded by the new brain into the concept of community and home. Food is prepared so that eating is more than subsistence. It's an aesthetic experience. Another essential for subsistence, communication, expands into conversation, storytelling, singing, enjoyment. Of all the rift's animals, humans became the most adept at adjusting mentally rather than changing physically. Whatever facet of the rift and the planet that humans have found themselves in, the formula for existence has worked. Upright posture, good vision, big brain, and free hands have led to tool-making, thought, language, society, and a capacity for enjoyment. All of the details that in their variation become culture. On the rift's lakes, for example. And on the savannas. Genetically, all humans are very much alike. But human cultures vary as much as the landscapes and as the animals and plants in them. And here, the great variety of the landscapes has caused a living explosion. The sheer number of animals is overwhelming. The greatest herds on Earth are found in the savannas that lie at the center of the rift, the scene of epic migrations of prey and predator. From the plains, this extravagant life extends to lakes as vast as inland seas. The exotic, the familiar, the beastly, the beautiful. Join us next time for the continuing story of the Great Rift of Africa.
On the Wing, The Life of Birds from Feathers to Flight by Bruce Brooks, a companion book to the Nature series, is available in bookstores everywhere.
This is PBS.